There's a man in Texas who has been waiting 6 years for a phone call. Not a call from a doctor, not a call about a house or a job or a loan. A call from a jeweler telling him that a stainless steel watch, retail price around $10,000, has finally arrived with his name on it. He's not rich by watch collector standards. He's not famous. He's just a man who 6 years ago walked into an authorized Rolex dealer and asked to buy a Daytona, and the man behind the counter didn't say, "That'll be $10,000. He said, "Let me put you on the list." 6 years later, he's still on the list. And here's the part that should stop you cold. If he got tired of waiting, he could walk 2 blocks down the street, find a gray market dealer, and buy that exact same watch today for $30,000 over retail. Triple the price. Same watch, same box, same warranty card. Somewhere in that gap between what Rolex charges and what people are willing to pay above it is one of the most quietly brilliant business strategies in the history of manufacturing. Because Rolex isn't failing to meet demand, Rolex is choosing not to. This is the story of how a single, stubborn, image-obsessed German immigrant built a watch company on the radical idea that the less available something is, the more the world will want it. That one idea, refined over more than a century, turned a small workshop in London into a private empire worth an estimated $15 billion a year, with no shareholders to answer to and no reason to ever stop saying no. To understand Rolex, you first have to understand that its founder never really felt like he belonged anywhere. Hans Wilsdorf was born in Bavaria in 1881. By the time he was 12, both of his parents were dead, his mother to illness, his father not long after. He was raised by uncles who, according to the little he ever wrote about his childhood, ran the family hardware business efficiently but without much warmth. Wilsdorf was shipped off to boarding school, and by all accounts, he learned early that nobody was going to hand him security. He would have to manufacture it himself. That word manufacture matters because Wilsdorf didn't manufacture watches at first, he manufactured impressions. In 1905, in his mid-20s, he moved to London and started a company that didn't make a single component. He bought Swiss movements, cased them, and sold them under a brand name. He didn't do it alone. His brother-in-law, Alfred Davis, put up much of the early capital and became his business partner, and together they called the original venture Wilsdorf and Davis, a name that, on its own, was never going to sell a single watch to anyone who couldn't already spell it correctly. That practical problem, more than any romantic instinct, may have been what actually pushed Wilsdorf toward something shorter. Export paperwork at the time required a company name to be stamped by hand onto the case of every single watch crossing a border. A long, clunky name slowed down that stamping process and ate into margins on every unit shipped. Wilsdorf needed 5 letters that would fit cleanly, read easily in English, French, and German alike, and sound distinctive enough that nobody would confuse it with a competitor. The name came a few years later in 1908, Rolex, chosen, legend has it, because it was short, easy to pronounce in any language, and looked good stamped onto the small face of a watch dial. Some accounts say the name simply sounded to Wilsdorf like the noise a watch makes when you wind it. Whether that's true or a marketing story he invented later almost doesn't matter. It's exactly the kind of clean, ownable myth-making that would define his entire career, turning even a mundane export logistics problem into the founding legend of a brand. Here's the thing people miss. In the early 1900s, wristwatches were considered feminine and slightly ridiculous. Serious men carried pocket watches. A wristwatch was a fragile little accessory, easily damaged, prone to letting dust and moisture destroy the movement inside. Wilsdorf didn't just have a watch company. He had a product category nobody respected yet. So he did something almost nobody else in the industry was doing. He obsessed over proof. In 1910, a Rolex became the first wristwatch in the world to receive Swiss chronometer certification, a precision rating that had, until then, been reserved for pocket watches and marine instruments. In 1914, Kew Observatory in England, the same institution that certified naval timekeeping equipment, gave a Rolex a rating so precise it was previously only given to marine chronometers. But precision alone doesn't build a legend. Wilsdorf needed a story the public could actually feel, and in 1926 he got one. That year, Rolex patented and released the Oyster, the world's first waterproof and dustproof wristwatch case, sealed so tightly that Wilsdorf claimed you could drop it in a fish tank and it would keep ticking. It was a genuinely impressive piece of engineering, but an engineering claim on a page of Swiss trade documents convinces nobody. Wilsdorf needed a human being to prove it in public in a way people couldn't ignore. He found her in a 26-year-old English typist named Mercedes Glatze. In October 1927, Glatze became the first British woman to swim the English Channel, a genuinely remarkable feat of endurance in freezing water. Wilsdorf, who by every account had an instinct for opportunity that bordered on prophetic, arranged for Glatze to wear a Rolex oyster on a cord around her neck for the swim. 10 hours in the frigid channel water. When she emerged, the watch was still running, still keeping perfect time, completely unaffected by 10 hours of saltwater immersion. Wilsdorf took out a full-page advertisement in the Daily Mail, not a subtle one. It showed the watch, told the story, and made an implicit promise to every reader. If this watch can survive the English Channel strapped to a swimmer's neck, imagine what it can do on your wrist. That single stunt, arguably history's first modern celebrity product endorsement, did something no amount of chronometer certificates could do. It made the Rolex oyster a story people wanted to tell each other. And Wilsdorf had learned the lesson that would define the entire empire he was building. A watch isn't a machine you sell, it's a story you let people wear. If the 1920s and 30s were about proving Rolex could survive extreme conditions, the decades after the Second World War were about proving Rolex belonged wherever human beings pushed the absolute edge of what was possible. Wilsdorf understood something that most manufacturers still don't fully grasp today. Exclusivity isn't built by keeping a product away from customers. It's built by attaching that product to achievements customers can only dream about. In May 1953, a New Zealand beekeeper named Edmund Hillary and a Nepali Sherpa mountaineer named Tenzing Norgay became the first people confirmed to reach the summit of Mount Everest. Rolex had supplied expedition members with Oyster perpetual watches specifically engineered to function at high altitude and extreme cold, a version that would later be marketed as the Explorer. When the news broke that the summit had been reached and reached wearing Rolex, the company didn't need to buy a single advertisement explaining precision engineering. The story told itself. If a watch can function on the roof of the world, what excuse do you have for doubting it on your commute? A few years later, in 1960, Wilsdorf's company went even further, quite literally down instead of up. A specially modified watch called the Deepseek Special was attached to the outside of the bathyscaphe Trieste as it descended nearly 11 kilometers to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the deepest known point in every ocean on Earth. Crushing pressure, total darkness, a hostile environment humans still barely understand today. The watch survived the descent and the return to the surface, still functioning perfectly. Everest, the Mariana Trench, the English Channel. Wilsdorf wasn't selling watches to explorers. He was making his watches characters in humanity's greatest physical stories, and every person who later strapped on a submariner or an explorer got to feel, for a moment, like a small participant in that same lineage of extremity. This era also gave Rolex two of its most enduring product lines. The Submariner, released in 1953, was designed for professional divers, water-resistant to depths recreational swimmers would never approach. The GMT Master, released in 1954, was developed in partnership with Pan American Airways for pilots who needed to track 2 time zones simultaneously as commercial jet travel made the world suddenly, dizzyingly smaller. Notice the pattern. Rolex wasn't building watches for the average consumer's average day. It was building tools for astronauts, explorers, deep-sea divers, and airline pilots, and only afterward allowing ordinary people to buy their way into that mythology. The tool came first. The status came as a byproduct, and that ordering competence before luxury is precisely what separated Rolex from brands that tried to manufacture prestige out of nothing but marketing. Wilsdorf died in 1960, having built something few founders ever manage. A company whose reputation had become almost entirely detached from any single advertisement, spokesperson, or era. But before he died, he made one final decision that would matter more than almost anything else in this story, a decision that had nothing to do with watches at all and everything to do with control. That decision would be tested more severely than Wilsdorf could have imagined, less than 2 decades after his death. In the 1970s, an entirely new kind of watch movement began sweeping through the Swiss watch industry, one built around a battery and a vibrating quartz crystal instead of a mainspring and a balance wheel. Quartz watches were dramatically cheaper to produce, far more accurate at keeping time, and required none of the decades of hand-finishing skill that mechanical watchmaking demanded. The event became known across the industry as the Quartz Crisis, and it nearly destroyed Swiss watchmaking entirely. Storied manufacturers closed. Tens of thousands of skilled watchmakers lost their jobs. Entire towns built around mechanical watch production hollowed out almost overnight, as Japanese and American quartz watches undercut them on price and beat them on accuracy. Rolex did not chase the trend into cheap, disposable mass production. It experimented briefly with its own quartz models, but its actual response to the crisis was in hindsight almost the opposite of what panic would suggest. Instead of racing toward the bottom on price, Rolex doubled down on mechanical craftsmanship, on precision certification, on the exact kind of old-world engineering pride that quartz technology was supposedly making obsolete. It bet that a customer who wanted a Rolex wasn't actually buying a device to tell time accurately. They were buying a mechanical object built the hard way, by hand, the way it had always been done. That bet turned out to be exactly right, and it's one of the clearest early proofs that Rolex understood something its competitors didn't. The harder a thing is to make, and the more deliberately unmodern it appears, the more valuable it can become to someone who already has a perfectly accurate quartz watch on their phone. We'll come back to that decision. First, we need to talk about what happens after the myth is built, when a company has to decide how exactly it's going to let the world buy in. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it. You cannot buy a Rolex directly from Rolex. There is no Rolex.com checkout page where you enter a credit card number and a Submariner arrives at your door in a box. Every single Rolex sold at retail passes through an authorized dealer, an independent jeweler who has been granted the right by Rolex to sell their product. And Rolex controls those dealers with a level of precision that would make most franchise businesses blush. The company decides how many watches each dealer receives. It decides which models. It can revoke a dealer's authorization entirely if they don't follow brand guidelines down to how the watches are displayed in the case. And most importantly, Rolex decides at the level of the entire company how many watches to manufacture in a given year for a given model, regardless of how much demand exists. This is the part that seems, on the surface, insane. Rolex is estimated to produce around 1 million watches per year. Industry analysts and dealer testimony suggest the company could likely produce significantly more if it chose to. Expand factories, hire more watchmakers, push volume the way almost any other consumer brand would in the face of overwhelming demand. It doesn't. Instead, for its most iconic models, the steel Daytona, the steel Submariner, the GMT Master with its Pepsi or Batman bezels, Rolex allocates only a small trickle of watches to each dealer, sometimes just 1 or 2 units of a specific reference per month, for a dealer that might have hundreds of customers wanting that exact watch. This is where the waitlist becomes something closer to a black market of social capital. A customer walks into an authorized dealer and asks about a Daytona. The salesperson, more often than not, will explain that there's a waiting list, but the way onto that list, and more importantly, the way up that list, isn't first come, first served. It's relational. Dealers keep track of purchase history, how much a customer has spent at that store over the years, whether they've bought watches nobody particularly wanted first, whether they've built a relationship with the sales staff. There's a term for this inside the industry, only half-jokingly, buying the ugly ones first. Want a shot at the Daytona everyone wants? Better start by buying a less coveted model or two, building a rapport, proving you're a real collector and not just a flipper. It's a system that would be described in any other retail category as a loyalty program crossed with an exclusive club membership. In watches, it's simply called the way it works. And crucially, Rolex, the parent company, largely lets this happen. It sets the scarcity at the top by controlling production numbers. The dealers manage the social theater underneath. Together, they've built a system where the actual constraint isn't factory capacity, it's permission. This dealer relationship isn't a modern invention either. Rolex's entrance into the American market in the early 20th century leaned heavily on partnerships with established, trusted jewelers rather than any attempt to sell directly to the public. Tiffany & Co., already a name synonymous with old money respectability in New York, was among the retailers that helped introduce Rolex to wealthy American clientele, long before the brand became a status symbol for the middle class. The lesson Wilsdorf absorbed from that early strategy stuck for the rest of the company's history. A watch sold through a trusted, exclusive gatekeeper carries a different kind of value than the exact same watch sold off a shelf in a department store. The dealer isn't just a distribution channel, the dealer is part of the product. Scarcity, once it's real, doesn't stay contained. It leaks, and when it leaks, it creates entire secondary economies. By the 2010s, something had shifted in how people related to Rolex. It stopped being purely a watch you bought and started being an asset you could trade. Gray market dealers, legal but unauthorized resellers, began buying up allocated watches from lucky customers and reselling them at enormous markups to people unwilling to wait years for a chance at retail price. Online forums built entire cultures around tracking sold prices, debating which references were about to pop, and treating certain Rolex models less like accessories and more like a commodities market with a very stylish physical form. Perhaps the most extraordinary illustration of what scarcity can do to value happened with a single reference, the Rolex Daytona, nicknamed the Paul Newman. In the 1960s and 70s, this particular Daytona variant with a distinctively styled dial was, by most accounts, one of the least popular models Rolex made at the time. Newman himself reportedly received his as a gift from his wife, Joanne Woodward, and wore it constantly, including, famously, while racing cars himself. But at the time, the exotic dial style simply didn't sell. Dealers apparently struggled to move them. Some accounts describe them sitting in display cases for years. Decades later, that same unwanted design, precisely because so few were made and even fewer survive in good condition, became one of the most valuable vintage watches on Earth. In 2017, Paul Newman's own personal Daytona sold at auction for over $17 million, at the time the most expensive wristwatch ever sold. A watch nobody wanted in 1970 became, in effect, a masterclass in what happens when limited supply meets a good enough story, given enough time. Rolex, watching all of this unfold from the outside, learned something extraordinarily valuable, and it wasn't subtle about acting on it. If discontinuing an unpopular model could accidentally create a $17 million legend, what could deliberately engineering discontinuation do? The company began retiring beloved references at what seemed at first like strange moments, right as a model was hitting peak popularity, not after it was fading. Collectors noticed the pattern quickly. The instant Rolex announced a model was being discontinued or updated, prices on the outgoing version would spike immediately, sometimes within hours of the announcement. Rolex had essentially discovered a lever that cost nothing to pull and reliably created demand, scarcity through an ending. By the time Instagram and later platforms turned watch collecting into genuine online culture, Rolex barely needed to advertise at all in the traditional sense. Every unboxing video, every watch check post, every debate about a 6-year waitlist became free marketing, proof over and over that this was a company whose product was worth more than what you paid for it, the moment you walked out the door. There's another anecdote worth pausing on here, because it shows just how far back this cultural momentum actually goes. In 1969, the actor Steve McQueen wore a Rolex Submariner while filming the racing film Le Mans, not as a paid endorsement, not as product placement negotiated by a marketing department, but simply because it was the watch McQueen personally owned and wore in his daily life. Decades later, that connection alone was enough to turn a specific reference of the Submariner into something collectors nickname to this day, chasing a version of the watch simply because of a photograph of an actor who wore his own personal property on camera. Rolex didn't pay for that moment. It didn't need to. The brand had become so embedded in the cultural idea of achievement, and cool that its watches were attracting free celebrity association almost by gravitational pull. Something similar happened with fictional characters. When Ian Fleming needed to put a watch on the wrist of James Bond in his novels, he chose a Rolex, reportedly a Submariner, as the timepiece of a British secret agent who was, by design, supposed to represent competence under extreme pressure. Fleming wasn't paid by Rolex to make that choice, and Rolex notably has never needed to pursue a sponsorship deal with the Bond film franchise the way many other brands eventually did with the actual film props. The association had already done its work in the public imagination decades earlier, for free, simply by being the obvious choice for a writer imagining what a serious man in a dangerous line of work would actually strap to his wrist. There's one more piece of evidence for how deeply this desirability took root, and it's not a flattering one, though Rolex itself seems to treat it almost as a backhanded compliment. Rolex is, by wide margin, the most counterfeited watch brand on Earth. Markets in cities from Bangkok to Istanbul to New York sell convincing fake Submariners and Daytonas by the millions every year, some of them good enough to fool a casual glance, most of them falling apart within months. Rolex spends real money fighting this, working with customs agencies worldwide to seize and destroy counterfeit shipments by the truckload. But the sheer scale of the counterfeit market is itself an unintentional monument to the brand's success. Nobody builds a black market industry around faking a watch nobody wants. The fakes exist precisely because the real thing has become such a universally recognized symbol of arrival, a name that means something even to people who have never set foot inside an authorized dealer and never will. This same recognizability fed directly into what became, by the 2010s, an entire genre of online content, the wrist check. Collectors and casual owners alike began posting photographs of their watch, often paired with a coffee cup or a car dashboard, for no reason other than to signal quietly that they belonged to a certain club. Rolex notably never had to ask anyone to do this. It never ran an influencer campaign paying people to post their watches. The behavior emerged entirely on its own, driven by owners eager to prove that the 6-year wait or the outrageous gray market premium had been worth it. Few brands in any industry have ever achieved marketing this organic, and fewer still have achieved it by doing less rather than more. Now we return to that decision Hans Wilsdorf made before he died in 1960, because it's the quiet engine underneath everything you've just heard. Wilsdorf had no children to inherit the company, and rather than sell Rolex to another business or take it public on a stock exchange, he did something almost no major company founder in history has done. He transferred ownership of Rolex entirely into a private charitable trust, the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. It's worth pausing on just how consistent this instinct for privacy was with the rest of Wilsdorf's life. He gave almost no interviews. Few photographs of him circulated publicly, and to this day, biographical detail about him remains thin compared to what's known about founders of comparably sized companies. Rolex's own corporate archive in Geneva is famously difficult to access, even for journalists and historians researching the brand's history, and the company has never published detailed sales figures, production numbers, or financial statements the way a publicly traded competitor would be legally required to. Where most global brands eventually build their mythology through relentless visibility, Wilsdorf built his by remaining, quite deliberately, almost invisible. He seemed to understand, decades before anyone had a name for it, that mystery is its own kind of asset, one that compounds in value the longer it's protected. That single decision means Rolex, to this day, has no public shareholders, no quarterly earnings calls, no activist investors demanding the company expand production to capture more market share and juice next quarter's numbers. No pressure ever to sacrifice long-term brand mystique for short-term revenue growth. Think about how radical that is in the context of virtually every other consumer brand on Earth. A publicly traded fashion or luxury company answers to shareholders who, quarter after quarter, want to see growth, more units sold, more revenue, more market penetration. That pressure, applied relentlessly over decades, is exactly what causes many luxury brands to eventually flood the market, chase mass appeal, and dilute the very exclusivity that made them valuable in the first place. Rolex, by contrast, answers to nobody but its own foundation's charter, which exists primarily to fund philanthropic causes, not to maximize shareholder value. There is no external force compelling Rolex to make more watches, sell into more markets, or discount its way into wider accessibility. The company can maintain artificial scarcity indefinitely, because the structure that owns it was specifically built to remove every incentive that would push against that scarcity. This is, in the end, the real secret of the Rolex empire. It isn't just a great story about a channel swim, or a mountain summit, or a weightless book kept behind a jeweler's counter. It's that every one of those tactics, precision certification, mythic sponsorships, dealer allocation control, deliberate discontinuation, is protected by an ownership structure immune to the single force that eventually corrodes almost every other scarcity strategy in business: the demand for growth. So think back to that man in Texas, still waiting for his phone call after 6 years. He's not the victim of a broken system. He's not evidence that Rolex has failed to keep up with the world's appetite for its watches. He is, in fact, exactly what Hans Wilsdorf was building toward from the very first advertisement he placed in the Daily Mail in 1927, a customer who wants the object more because he cannot simply have it. Rolex could almost certainly make more watches. It could sell directly online tomorrow and eliminate the entire dealer allocation system. It could flood every boutique on Earth with steel Daytonas until the waitlists disappeared entirely. It won't, because the waitlist was never the flaw in the business model. The waitlist is the business model. A century ago, an orphaned watchmaker's son learned that the deepest kind of value isn't created by making something available to everyone. It's created by making something worth waiting for and then building an empire, brick by brick, generation by generation, designed never to give that feeling away. There's a quiet postscript to this story that Wilsdorf himself never lived to see, but that he would almost certainly have appreciated. Today, walk into almost any authorized dealer in the world and ask the person behind the counter how long the wait list really is. More often than not, they won't give you a number. They'll smile and say something like, "It depends on your history, on your patience, on how badly you actually want it." That non-answer, repeated in nearly identical form in Geneva, in Tokyo, in Dubai, in a strip mall outside Houston, is itself the most successful product Rolex has ever manufactured. Not a movement, not a case, not a bracelet. A feeling that somewhere out there, a watch already has your name quietly attached to it, and all you have to do is prove you deserve the call.